Hello and welcome to the AC Tips, day 7. I'm in a very hot country, it's 36, 37 degrees outside, and so if I'm going to do any thinking, and this is me doing some thinking, I have to turn the AC on, make a cup of tea, for which there's never enough ice. You see the ice is already gone. And then what I'm going to do is draw a topic out of a hat. It's actually a tray. And talk about it. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to draw a topic out of a hat, and then I'm going to use these prompts: true, false, weird, rant, and need a word for, which are prompts that I've used for joke writing, because my aim in this show is to talk about project management, but try and tell jokes about it. That's the crazy idea that I have for this show. And so that's what I'm going to do. And I've just drawn a subject out. And again, it's pirate ship. I need to get better at drawing. Actually, I'm going to draw another one because I'm sick of talking about pirate ship. I know that's cheating slightly, but who cares? Right. What's this one? Bet. I talked about that one yesterday as well. Did I just write pirate ship and bet on things? Okay, here we go. Swamp. Right. Okay. Tell you a true thing about the swamp and the way that I use the idea of the swamp in the book. The way that I talk about the swamp in the book is I talk about it as a complicated space, a complex space. So the idea is that if you have a swamp, and this is, of course, it's an imaginal swamp. It's an imaginary swamp. But think about a swamp in a real place. It's got owners. It might have had buildings there in the past. It might have had infrastructure there in the past. It might have toxic waste there. So it has owners. It might have people who live there. It might have people who want to live there. It might have people who are indigenous and want to live there, and other people who don't want them to live there. There may be all sorts of rules and regulations regulating this swamp. So in the book, what I talk about is that all projects are swamps. They're complex spaces, and trying to do things in those spaces requires you to know as much as you possibly can about those spaces. And so it isn't just like the way often that projects are shaped and described is that, here's a list of things to do. You do them. It's straightforward. And very often it's not straightforward because some of those people who live in that space want to stop you doing what you want to do. Some of the people who want to live there want to have some influence on what you're going to do. There may be people, think about ecological campaigners. There are ecological campaigners sitting in Western countries who have opinions on swamps that aren't even in their country, that they don't own, that they don't have any influence over, but they want to have influence over. And in projects, there are similar things. There are regulators sitting outside of the project, way, way away from the project itself, but they have opinions on it. And all of these things are relevant. So this is kind of, when people say, rhetorically, why does it take so long? This is one of the answers. Why does it take so long? Because it's a swamp. It's a complex space with lots and lots of stuff going on. And a lot of what you need to do is surveying. So part of that is user research, talking to the people who might be using the software. Part of it is trying to get actual working software to operate in this complex environment, this swamp, and seeing who pops out of the woodwork. But also there's another aspect of it, which there isn't really a kind of particular activity in Agile that talks about this. It's really kind of one of the many, many things that a product manager is supposed to do, that a product owner is supposed to do, is to kind of understand what's going on in the organization. What boardroom coup has just happened? Who is fighting with whom inside the organization? Who might be about to take over the organization? Why is this a really, really important project for the organization? Because one of their competitors has already got a product like this. All of those, see, that's something that's happening in another swamp that's relevant to your swamp. It's a complicated business. That's the true thing. False. Okay, let's come at this a different way. How can I say something false about swamps and projects? Projects aren't swamps. Projects are really, really simple. Projects are even playing fields. Projects are green fields that have never had any other kind of aspects, any other kind of building on them. There are no problems with building there. It's a perfectly level piece of space with no complicated ownership, no complicated... You see how ridiculous this is? When you start to think about the idea of green field, what would a green field actually look like? What would a perfect green field look like? There is no such as a green field. True, false, weird. This is getting harder. If you wanted to be really absolutely sure that your project failed, you would do nothing whatsoever to find out about the environment of the swamp in which it's being developed. So you would never talk to any of the users. You would never talk to any of the people in the organization. You would never show anybody in the organization what you're going to do and what you are doing. You would never try to get your working software and deploy it in this organization. You would never try and find out why it is that the people who want this thing want it. That's what you do if you were trying to make this project fail. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like either the way that you've done projects, or does that sound like the way that you've been expected to do projects? You just get into this box and do as you're told, and nobody mushroom management type thing. That's kind of the weird thing, that kind of like very often this is the usefulness of like knocking your kind of point of view around from all these different directions. That this is very often how people try and execute projects. In fact, often this is kind of like painted as the way that you should execute projects. You have a list of things to do, you just get on and do them. You don't worry about what's going on in the rest of the organization. You don't worry about how your project is interacting with other projects. You don't worry about how your project is interacting with politics, with economics, with what's going on in the kind of current politics inside the organization, with the history inside the organization. You don't worry about any of that stuff. That's weird. Rant. So filled with anger, it's hard where to know where to start. But I think I'm going to start ranting here about rhetorical questions, because I've just mentioned some rhetorical questions. That's not entirely kind of related to this swamp thing, but kind of like, is this weird thing that kind of like people ask rhetorical questions like, well, why is it taking so long? How can that be so difficult? And kind of like, the interesting thing about these rhetorical questions is that I think if you like unrhetoricize them, can you do that? Can you unrhetoricize something? Unrhetoricize something? If that's not a word, I'm claiming it, right? Unrhetoricize, right? So if you de-rhetoricize, if you take the rhetoricalness out of these questions, then you can find some really interesting answers. So why is it taking so long? Well, it's very often that there's an intersection of a lot of these different things in the swamp. That's why it's taking so long. Why is this so difficult? Because very often, I think in an Edward de Bono book. I read lots of junk psychology books. I read this in an Edward de Bono book, that people don't like revealing their values. Sometimes they reveal them by the way they behave. In fact, that's one very powerful way which they reveal the way they reveal their values. They've got value. Oh, yeah, they've got mission statements and corporate values and all that bollocks. But their actual values, they don't like revealing those. And those are the ones that you actually need to find out about if you're actually going to deliver something in a complex space. You need to find out about their actual values. And so very often the answers to these rhetorical questions, unfortunately, is always impertinent. Like answering a rhetorical question is a kind of like weird, impolite kind of subversive move, but do it in quiet while people aren't asking. Why is it that we can't deliver this? Well, one of the reasons is because this is it's actually a big thing. One of the reasons is because the organisation values something in this swamp, in this complex space. The organisation values something more than it values this project. What is that? Well, it might be that it values the appearance of absolute security more than it values this project. It values some other kind of organisational value. I don't know, kind of like military pride, or kind of like what else could it be? Corporate unity or something like that. So the answer is that the rhetorical reason, the de-rhetoricized question is that it values something else more. That was a rant, wasn't it? Okay, and there's one final one. Need a word for. Yeah, so kind of this has been really useful. I've really enjoyed doing this. I need a word for that kind of corporate research that you need to do into an organisation to find out about that swamp, because it isn't user research, and you kind of get it sometimes by doing user research, and it isn't testing using working software, although by trying to get working software out into the world, you very, very often reveal all sorts of things about the organisation. There's no better way of finding out who the really powerful people are in an organisation than trying to get some working software out there, because people will try and stop you. This reminds me of, apparently this is a joke that the king, my king, it might not be your king, King Charles, often tells, I think it might be his only joke, which is that you'll be never alone on a desert island as long as you take with you the equipment to make a dry martini. Because as soon as you start to make a dry martini, somebody will jump out from behind a tree and tell you that that's not the way you make a martini. Well, very similarly, you'll never be alone if you try and release software inside of an organization, because the minute you try and release software inside of an organization, somebody jumps out from behind a tree or a filing cabinet or something and says, you're not allowed to release this software for the following reasons. So that's kind of one thing that is part of this kind of research that you need to do, that I need a word for with it, which is this research inside the organization, which is not user research, and it's not getting working software out there. It's something else. It's finding out enough about the organization. Of course, some of this stuff is going to be commercial in confidence. Some of this stuff is going to be embarrassing. And some of this stuff is just going to be completely opaque to the people inside the organization. They're not going to have seen a map of the organization. They're not going to really know how the organization works. They're just working in their little silos. So, yes, that's kind of lots of things about the swamp that I wasn't expecting I was going to say, that I ended up saying because of these prompts of true, false, weird, rant, and need a word for.